My presentation is on the analysis of a Qin's highway called Zhidao with different computational approaches. And thank you for introduction. I'm a UCL master student doing computational archaeology. And so it's basically an overview of, sorry, I'll carry on. So the overview of the presentation is mainly kind of introducing the road itself and some of the research questions and methodology of the way I'm doing this research and study, and the kind of the preliminary result I've got for the moment. So I've been working on this road for a while now, actually. It's been working on this road for like roughly 2 years as a continuation from my undergrad over in Leicester. So the road itself is dated around 212 BC and is over in China. Well, it's northern and western China, and it's constructed by the first emperor of China called Qin Shi. And the main reason of the construction is mainly to fought against the northern nomads up in northern China. And what we've got in terms of sources is mainly historical. So a lot of the Chinese academia focus a lot researching on historical sources. In this case, this historical sources called Shiji is written around 100 years later after the construction of the road. So it's not the latest, but it's close enough in a sense. The road itself is roughly 895 kilometers long. It could go across 2 different provinces in modern China. And in terms of the archaeology, it's quite scarce, actually. So as you can see from the imagery, what we know is the road on top left here, top left over here, is very different to other roads in other civilization. I do a lot of Roman roads research, and it's not like the traditional Roman roads where you have different 5 layers and stratigraphy, whereas over here is usually 1 or 2 layers. And the way they built the roads is basically to chop part of the mountain off and leave it on the other side, and then flatten the surface of the road where you can kind of go through. And in terms of the road itself, this is part of the trackway. So imagining there's a horse, like a chariot will go across the thicker lines here, and the other line is the drainage. So that's kind of the overview of what the road's about. And the controversy of it is there are several research topics, actually. So the research started around 1970s, and then since then, so 40 years from now, the most of the research is either focused on both the terminals and trying to see where the road actually starts and ends, and also a lot of research in terms of the history of it by researching the impact of the road, especially the connotations, the various aspects of the connotations. But the issue is there's a controversy when it comes to how the road goes. So as you can see, the road is kind of divided into 3 sections over here, where the northern and southern sections, there are like consensus already, whereas the majority part of the road is kind of just unknown in a sense. So there are agreements where both of these proposed routes are dated around the same time, so around the Qin Dynasty. But which one is exactly the road in question is debatable. So mainly the research questions are trying to identify some of the characteristics of the road using regression, and also kind of discuss which of the road is much more plausible when it comes to using computational methods. In this case, it's least cost path analysis. So I will go into this 2 types of analysis in the next slide. So as I said, I will use regression as kind of a 3 stages type of analysis. The first one is regression. The other 2 is related to least cost path analysis. So the stage 1 is a logistic regression analysis. So people are a lot more familiar when it comes to a normal linear regression. So where you basically plot an XY graph and there's a line diagonally going through the XY graph. So it's the reason why I'm not using linear regression is because logistic regression, on the other hand, kind of deal with potential values where it's only 0 to 1 instead of a continuous outcome. and they try to fit a S-shaped probability curve into the graph, which I will show you later on how the graph is kind of looks like. And instead of having a lot of uncertainty, the main reason is linear regression have a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the middle ground, whereas a logistic one is a bit more either 0 or 1, a lot less intermediate values in a sense. So you can see on the slide, there are some characteristics. These characteristics are proposed by previous research, and they will become my covariates. So the idea of regression is to kind of analyze or assess the relationship between the covariates and dependent variables. So these are sites and non-sites in a sense. I'll explain a little bit more in terms of that from. And so when it comes to the sampling strategy, as I said, like non-site. So what is non-site in the sense where it's like using an analogy of you have 100 people with two types of shirts, like red or blue. You can't, statistically, you can't just look at red shirt and use red shirt as a sample. You have to create another sample called blue shirt and then see how red shirt represent in the overall sample size. So that's why there's always site and non-site when it comes to regression. It's kind of statistically proven that's how it all works out. So mainly because the lack of extensive excavations, I will be sampling both non-sites and known sites. So in that front, and by basically, as you can see on the graph here, is this is one of the known routes and create a buffer around it and using a stratified sampling system of trying to create the non-sites and the known sites. So there are two sets of samples, as I alluded here, is kind of either approximately 2 kilometers apart or 1 kilometer apart. And for the regression, there are kind of two stages as well. So the first one is the kind of the univariate logistic regression, where instead of combining all the covariates together, we're just looking at covariates, one covariate and the site and the non-site, so the dependent variables. Mainly the idea is to kind of assess the statistical relationship between both properties. And that's the result. I'm not going to bore you all the maths behind it, but it's basically, if we look on the graph itself, if it allows me to do it, yes. So this is kind of a logistic graph, and the ideal situation is similar to like this, where it goes like a little S shape. And it's kind of showing me, well, obviously in the sense where there's a positive coefficient, and I'm looking at just the ridges as an example, and then meaning that because it's a positive coefficient, so it's more likely to find sites in ridge or with a location which is a ridge. And so it's kind of give me a good example on the reason why these covariates, whether they are plausible or whether they are true or not in a sense. And then if we go back to the really complicated table, there are different values of what we call p-values, kind of assessing the significance of the model. And if we just look at this value over here, because p-value in the sense where if it's below 0.05, is meaning that the model itself is very significant. So in this case, both of the fuzzy ridges in both the samples size, they are quite significant. So in this case, I should be using it as in later on in my stage 3. So the overall example or the overall results of the regression or the first stage of the regression, to be fair, for the southern and the northern sections, is kind of hitting like most of the characteristics that is kind of raised in previous research, which is good. I know the northern section can be a lot less, but I'll explain that later on. And once all the univariate logistic regression is processed, then we're trying to combine everything together into a multivariate. So in regression in archaeology right now, mostly is used for what we call archaeological predictive modeling, is widely used in commercial archaeology, mostly in America and in Asia and in Australia, less so in Europe, but it's developing rapidly in Europe because it's a very good way of predicting sites without much in terms of cost. And what I'm using it, instead of predicting stuff, I'm using it to assess which of the covariates that I should use for the later on stage 3. So as you can see, there might be some overgeneralization in previous research about the characteristics of the road. We should kind of separate in terms of the analysis when it comes to doing the southern section on its own and the northern section on its own. So after that, we're going to kind of stage 2. So least cost path analysis, very briefly, it's basically using a computer calculates the cost that is the least effort to travel from one point to the other. And then it's kind of assumed that the human person or whoever we in question, or the animal or whatever, it uses the least effort. So there are some problematic, as you can kind of think about already. But I'll kind of quickly go through why this research is very useful when it comes to using least cost path analysis. And the other two terms need to come across is isotropic and anisotropic. Isotropic is related to least cost path, which is not related to direction. So because imagining you're walking up, like uphill is probably a bit easier going downhill, because I don't know, your knee might hurt when you're going downhill in a faster rate. So so direction needs to take into consideration when calculating all these cost paths. And basically the generic one is using slope as a cost service and running from just the southern endpoint to the northern endpoint. Very basic. There were no friction, no other variables I need to put in. So the result is terrible, which is great, which is ideal actually. So as you can see, the green one, it's the isotropic one. So it doesn't take consideration of the direction of travel, and it kind of follows the river, which is one of the issues when it comes to least cost path analysis. It's very environmental deterministic. It's a thing, it's a huge debate when it comes to just computational archaeology in general. And in the other side, when it comes to anisotropic, yeah, it might take a consideration when it comes to the environment itself or the typography itself, but it's just going in a straight line because there are no friction. Everything across the landscape is just the same when it comes to friction. What I mean by friction is like basically when you try to walk across a grassland that is taken care of, completely mown, it's a lot easier, right? But when it comes to in the grassland where no one bothers moaning it, moaning it, and in the sense where it just haven't been taken care of, it causes friction when you kind of try to traverse through that grassland. So that's kind of the analogy when it comes to the friction. So one point I need to add is, as you can see, typographically, the landscape is very different. So if you draw a line right here, the southern part is a mountain range. It's called dual mountain range. So the slope and just the terrain itself is very different to the north, where the north is a desert plain completely. So that's the reason why the southern section and northern section have a very different result. And then finally is kind of the stage 3, which at the moment I'm still processing it. It's basically using what we've learned from stage 1 and stage 2 and implement it into the model creation. So I've divided the road itself into 4 different sections. The reason why is because the typography is very different, as I mentioned before, where section 1 and section 4 is used to build like a best fit model. How do I do that? I'll be using the regression result and all the covariates and then try to build a best fit model by calculating the average nearest distance between the known sites and the hypothetical route. And then once that model is created, it will be implemented into section 2 for the model created in section 1, and then section 4, the best fit model will put into section 3. So the result, don't know yet. So hopefully by the end of my master's, if you're interested about the result in a sense, I will definitely try to publish my dissertation. Yes, thank you very much.